Welcome to the fourth video in this series of playing the English defense against d4 openings from white. And we're going to look at some crazy ideas now. Now, I must warn you, this video should really have a rating of about 15. That's not because of any swearing or any rudeness. It's because some of the ideas shown in this video you really shouldn't show kids because it involves the early maneuver of black's queen into the game. And often in the English defense, one of the main ideas is to swing the black queen at an early stage over to h4. Now, you might be thinking, what on earth is that all about? Why should you bring your queen out early at the start of the game? Well, that's just what happens in the English defense, and it's one of the main ideas. Now, the reason I say you shouldn't show this to kids, it reminds me of a story I've mentioned before when I was teaching kids in school and I was telling them, well, you don't bring your queen out early, you have to bring your knights and bishops out before your queen. And then one of the kids I was teaching went and watched a game of Nakamura's, and Nakamura, of course, brought his queen out on move 2. And he came back to me a couple of days later and he said, Sir, Nakamura brought his queen out early and he's better than you. So I'm like, Nakamura, you just destroyed all of the teaching I've done with these kids. Thank you, Hikaru. So that's why I'm saying it should come with a warning. And in this video, we're going to look at these ideas in the English defense where the queen comes out early. And we're also going to have a look at what happens if white pushes with the d pawn to d5 quite early in order to block out your bishop on b7. So they're the two main things this video is going to contain. So first of all, let's start with the what I'd say the main setup: d4, e6, c4, and as soon as white plays c4, we go b6. And here, well, we're going to finish our coverage of the move e4 first. So let's just finish this coverage and then we'll come on to the move d5 afterwards, which is a very interesting and sensible move. But first of all, e4 is a move we've been looking at a lot. So let's see what we should do here after bishop b7. And now the last video contained bishop d3. And the other main move is knight to c3. So you should know what you do here. You've done stage 1, attack the center. Stage 2, you bring your other bishop out. And we looked at most moves here, but the only move we haven't really looked at is queen to c2. Another way white can defend the e4 pawn. And this is really the last way that we haven't looked at white can sufficiently defend that e4 pawn. Now, in this example, I believe the best move is to fly our queen out to h4. And okay, it's a little bit insane, but it has a lot of good points to it. Number one, you are actually threatening to go queen takes h4, queen takes e4, check here. And now that our normal crowbar move f5 is not as strong, because the whole point of our crowbar move f5 is to normally release our bishop against g2. But here, the pawn on g2 is well defended by the bishop on f1, so our crowbar move loses a lot of its points. The other reason we used our crowbar move is for quick development, but all these don't really work in this position because queen c2 is quite a clever move. But in this position, queen to h4 works surprisingly well. White can't guard the pawn on e4 with f3 because it's pinned. And white really has two choices here. He either tries to block the bishop out with d5 or defends the pawn with bishop to d3. Now, if he goes d5 in this position, I would say a simple solution is simply to take on d5 and then just play either knight to f6 and try to get castled, rook to e8 quickly. Or another theoretic move is the move c6 here. And I like c6 because you're trying to open up the center of the board for your bishop on b7. And these positions should be totally fine for black. Now, if white does not push forwards with d5, but instead tries to play bishop to d3, guarding the pawn on e4, well, now the crowbar move, pawn to f5, is much more effective. Because the bishop on b7 in some variations can capture the pawn on g2. And the thing we have to remember about our queen on h4 and these lines, do not get too scared. This queen, if it can't obviously win a pawn on e4 or d4 or c4, the queen will often, in these variations, when attacked, drop back to h5 or g4 if you want to be more sort of going for gold, and then it can come back to f7. So it's actually quite safe queen. I mean, for example, here, white should either play g3 or knight to f3. And after knight to f3, it's now probably the correct moment to capture on c3. Check. I like this move here. And after something like queen takes c3, queen to g4 is a very nice move because we're keeping the threats against g2 and pawn takes e4. And again, white's position is becoming overextended in the center. Something like castles, we just take on e4. Knight to e5, our queen can even go to h4 now. And it's very safe here. We've won a safe pawn in this position. So in actual fact, this queen h4 idea seems to work very well against queen c2. I mean, bishop to d3, now we use the crowbar. And a typical bad move that white could play here is a move like g3. Yes, it attacks our queen, but it also weakens the diagonal for our English defense bishop on b7. Now the queen can just drop back to h5 or somewhere similar, and after something like bishop e2, even queen to c7. And look at the pressure we are putting on white's pawn on e4. Immense pressure there. So this looks very promising, this whole line for black. And I've gone a little bit more into some variations with this in the PGN notes. So have a look at those if you want to see some of this in a bit more detail. So against queen c2, because our crowbar move is not as effective here, queen to h4 is an intriguing and very interesting idea here. First used by Tony Miles to great effect. And Tony Miles, England's first ever grandmaster, was a really big fan of this queen h4 move, in particular variations. Now, what else can white play here? Well, I think one of the other main moves is d5. And the point behind this is to try to shut out black's bishop on b7. And again, ridiculous looking move, but Tony Miles was a massive fan of playing queen to h4 here. Can you Adam and Eve it? That's actually London rhyming slang for can you believe it? In London, there's something called Cockney rhyming slang. And what you do, you rhyme a saying with a phrase, and then that's what it is. I probably really confused you there, but maybe you can look that up. Cockney rhyming slang. So can you Adam and Eve it is rhyming with can you believe it? Okay, I'll get back to the chess now. But queen to h4 is Tony Miles' very interesting and actually very good idea. You know what? He even played this move and got a good position against Karpov when Karpov was world champion. So it's a kind of move I would love to play in a game of chess. And, well, the point is we want to put pressure on c4. Our queen, if attacked in a number of cases, can often drop back to h5. And often our knight on g8 quickly comes f6, e4. Let's just have a look at this in play. Well, in one game, this is a game between Ogard and Tony Miles. White played e3, defending the pawn on c4. And now Tony continued, knight to f6. And another point is if white plays g3, our queen can come to e4. Very annoying for white. If the knight ever attacks the queen, well, the queen can come back to h5. Again, quite annoying for white because the queen on h5 even puts pressure on the pawn on d5. So in the game in question, white actually played a3, tried to stop annoying bishop b4 checks, but look at what happens now. Look at the initiative Tony got. Bishop b7, pressurizing d5. White attacked the queen, and the queen simply came back to h5. And now black has 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces attacking d5. So white has to do something with his pawn. Pawn takes e6, and now after f takes e6, I think it's clear black's opening has been a triumph. All of black's pieces working very well, and black won very quickly in the game. The game continued. Bishop e2, And now queen g6, a clever little idea, pressurizing g2. Knight to h4, and Tony now moved his queen to h6. Really crazy chess, but actually, if you think about it, it's quite logical. We're attacking the knight now. Bishop to f3, trying to exchange off this strong bishop on b7. Black, of course, just developed. And now g3, a typical move for the English defense. g5. Here comes Gary the g-pawn. And now after e4, white tries to pin the pawn, but black's knight came into e5. And it's clear here, all of black's pieces are swarming into the attack. The game finished bishop g2, queen g7, threatening the knight on h4. f4, Tony took on h4. And after pawn takes e5, knight to g4. And real problems here for white. Black can always castle queenside. Where does white put his king? If white tries to castle kingside, bishop c5 check is coming in. And knight to f2 check. White's king will not last another day. So this crazy idea, let's go back to the start of playing d4, e6. And now you only go b6 generally after c4. If white pushes ahead with d5, bishop b7 is playable, but it doesn't make as much sense now because you're not really threatening anything. But queen to h4, Tony's idea of going queen to h4 and then queen to h5, pressurizing d5, becomes a very solid possibility. Now, his game against, I have to show you his game against Karpov because that was very interesting. That continued knight to c3. Now, taking on c4 here is very risky because white would go e4 and gain a lot of tempo. Tony instead just developed bishop to b4. And he got a very good game against Karpov very quickly. Karpov broke the pin, bishop d2. And now we see this knight to f6 move, again, pressurizing d5 and ideas of knight to e4. e3, Tony took on c3 so that his knight could come to e4, threatening checkmate on f2. Queen c2, Tony got rid of the bishop on c3, and now he simply castled kingside. And after g3, he put his queen on e4 here, a much better square, and the queen dropped back to g6. And again, it's this hyper-modern idea. In these positions, you attack the center, bishop b7. And he gained this equal position against Karpov. So I think a very successful opening. So I really like this idea in the opening. If your opponent pushes forwards with d5 in a number of positions, well, especially this position, you can consider the idea queen to h4. Now, when else can white play the move d5? What other positions do we have to consider? Well, another move we have to look at is the line with knight to c3, where white actually delays going e4. And I mentioned this before, where white doesn't actually give you this target on e4 to attack. So what should we do in these setups? Well, we should go bishop to b7, stage 1 first. And now, given a chance, what I'd like to do anyway, whether white goes e4 or not, I still, in these setups, I always like going bishop to b4 and f5 anyway. So if white doesn't put the pawn on e4, I'd say go bishop to b4 if you can and f5 anyway. And then knight to f6 and knight to e4 becomes a main idea if white doesn't play e4. Now, what if white plays a3, which I've faced a number of times, stopping bishop to b4? Well, we can't do bishop to b4 now, so let's just use our normal crowbar move, f5. And what we want to do here now is go knight to f6 and knight to e4 quickly. Where should our bishop on f8 go? This is the next question you should ask yourself. It can't go to b4 anymore. Well, in actual fact, the bishop can come to f6 often. A lovely diagonal. And if white tries to play d5 in these positions, now queen to h4 doesn't make as much sense here because our pawn is on f5 and this has weakened us. So I'd only go queen to h4 when white goes d5 if our pawn is back on f7. In these positions, when our pawn is on f5 and our opponent goes d5, a rule to remember is to try to get your dark square bishop first to f6. So when white plays d5, if we can get our dark square bishop to the h8, a1 diagonal, look at that diagonal. It's a beautifully opened diagonal for that bishop. We will get a good game. I was playing ex-women's, I believe, world champion Peng from Holland. and that continued bishop to e7, g3, bishop f6, lovely square for my bishop. One of my bishops is not so great, but my other bishop now becomes good. Bishop d2, knight e7, bishop g2. This pawn on d5 is pinned. My opponent can't move that pawn. Castles, knight to h3. And now it's a more maneuvering game here, I have to admit to that, but I came up with a good maneuver in this game. Knight to c8. Castles, knight to d6, attacking the pawn on b3. And after b3, I've only got one piece, which is a problem. My knight on b8. And I brought this knight into the game with one important idea in mind. I want to get a knight to the e4 square. And this combined with my bishop on f6 gave me a beautiful position, and I ended up winning the game. So a bit more positional, these ideas, a bit more tricky when white doesn't put on pawn on e4. But as I said before, and we'll see in the next video, if white doesn't go pawn to e4, then we should try to go bishop to b4 anyway, and f5, when we can decide upon ideas, but it's mainly about the e4 square in those particular variations. Now, really, I think that's pretty much most things we're going to discuss in this video here. This d5 move is something you will face at certain points. And these videos, I would recommend you watch them a couple of times each. And whenever you face these ideas in a game, you're going to have to try to remember and work out whether it's the right stage to play queen to h4 or another idea. Now, the rule was if your pawn's on f7 and white goes d5, well, then queen to h4 is very strong. And you just have to work this out during the game. So you're playing a new opening. Do not rush your moves. Just take your time in the opening, and then hopefully you will come through and find the right variations. But I hope you agree there's some very interesting ideas with this queen coming out to h4, these ideas here. And we've seen this time and time again in this type of opening. So that's all we're going to look at now in this video. And in the next video, we'll have a look at some other possibilities that white may try. And that will really cover you for pretty much everything you will face in the English defense. Everything that's important anyway.